I'm waiting.
Now, the moderator will introduce you to the learned participants.
Oh, yes, I forgot. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Sumari ma'am.
Yeah.
Secretary sir also has come and he is very much available.
Okay. Good noon to everyone. And I am Dr. Suma here doing the moderation for the session this afternoon. And indeed, today is going to be a very remarkable day as we are on the 5th day of the session of the webinars that's been organized by very eminent scholars of Tamil Nadu. And the credit goes to Mannar College for having initiated it, along with the University of Chennai, as well with Mother Teresa, deemed to be the Women's University. And it's such a pleasure to be here this afternoon, because it's something very important. We are having an international scholar amidst us. Like, we will be very happy to listen to his splendid lecture, and we would welcome Dr. Shikumbuzo Mngadi, and he is a great scholar of South Africa from the University of Johannesburg. He has taken his doctorate from KwaZulu University of Natal, and that is where he has done his PhD, but he is working for the University of Johannesburg, and indeed a great scholar in South African literature of culture and traditions, right? His remarkable career goes with his great interest in what we call as the literary theories and cultural thematic interpretations. He has got a great fancy to read a lot of books of varied interpretative skills embedded within. For example, if you would take in a specific reference, he would love to read works of Roman Jacobson, Michael Bakhtin, and with deliberations from the Frankfurt School of Hall and the Stuart Hall School of Literature. And this is something very varied. He has got what do we call as the interest that's widening his thought processes. And I feel it is a cumulative understanding to the fact that he's impetuously a great scholar, forwarding himself to learning and literature. His focus of study is not only in African and Western literature, surprisingly to be, when I would read his biopic or a bio detail of his interest, he has great liking to Salman Rushdie. He likes to read a lot of Salman Rushdie's cultural transformations through his novels, and that is one of his belief in cultural transformation of learning through African and a mixed match with other cultures. So that is again a unique entity of Dr. Mngadi, I should say. And his special interests are not only from these cultures, it plays from Renaissance and to Romantic poetry, inclusive of Spenser, until Shelley. He has taken in, and he's got a lot of thought process dwelling with metaphysical poetry and Jacobean poetry. And so then you can imagine how much of reading he would be doing all the way through to cover up such a vast expanse of the journey, the trajectory of literature that he is focusing on. And there are many interesting preferential ideologies that he is taking in as an idolatory formation in his poetic expression, more so, which keeps long lasting in his literary turns. And it's interesting to know that he has got that multifarious intentions to work and to bring into reality the focus of modernity through some of his studies and cultural interpretations with films, which I think in the near future is going to be the great focus for him, and is going to put forward to the society. And we wait to get to know more about it from you, Doctor. Your interpretations on films and dramas and theoretical study on literary terms. That's going to be of great interest for our own people, our youngsters, our budding scholars of literature. Nevertheless, his research areas of South Africa draw all the creative ideas from the dramas and the films with reference to historiography. There's a lot of historical background, I should say, that he takes into reality, and masculinities that he puts in with the ideologies of the characters, whatever he is coming in focus, and that is well acclaimed of his knowledge. So it's such a great privilege to have you, dear doctor, here this day. And here, very fine, I would love to quote a very nice quote from Waldo Emerson. He says, "The office of a scholar is to cheer, to raise, and by showing them facts amidst appearances." Amidst appearances, I should say, in nature, corresponds to the state of mind that you are going to dwell in with us. And here this noon, we are feeling elated to have you here, Dr. Shikumbuzo. And that is how it is going to be such a scholarly session. Having such a scholar with us is such a boon. And the platform is open to you now, dear doctor. Thank you so much, and we welcome you all. And the opportunities for having had you here and for us through the departments of the Elite. Thank you so much, and a very good noon, and hope we enjoy the session.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I feel a bit nervous now to start my speech. Can I have a drink of some water very quickly? Thank you for that introduction. I just wanted to have a drink of some water. So I'm going to move the screen to the bottom so that I can access my my PowerPoint presentation. Can you see the screen there? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Admin, help him.
No, sir, you have to press the green button again. No, zoom, first you open the zoom. From the zoom window, you need to press the green button.
Okay. And I can see everyone now, and press the green button and share. Can you see the screen now?
Yes, sir, yes, sir. You go to the first slide.
The slide is not moving, so I don't know if I'm...
Use the arrow button.
Up arrow, sir, up arrow.
Up arrow.
Yes, I am using the arrow button, but the screen is not moving.
Can you click on the screen first? You need to click on the screen, then you can move up.
Okay, that's right. It's starting now, so you can see the beginning of my presentation now. The language debates in African studies.
Yes, sir. Yes, Professor.
Okay, sure. So I'm going to start now. Well, my interest in this debate, of course, is based on the fact that South Africa entered, well, what one could call the African continental consciousness after 1994, and before then, South Africa was pretty much insular, was pretty much closed. The governments from 1910 right up to 1993, before 1994, before the beginning of the post-apartheid government, closed South Africa from not just the rest of the continent, but also from the rest of the world. So the debates that were taking place about African languages and writing in African languages elsewhere on the continent were not available in South Africa from 1910 right up to well, the late 80s, because in the early 90s, South Africa began to open up as apartheid began to fall. So I'm interested in this debate about language and about writing in African languages because it has continued to exercise a great deal of attention in the South African Academy, and it has raised some critical debates about the nature of the English department in South African University, as it did in the 1980s when the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who not started the debate as such, but intensified it by arguing that he was not going to write in English anymore, that after 1986, he was going to write in his mother tongue, Kikuyu. It sort of galvanized people who had engaged in this debate long before him. In South Africa, for example, this debate, which was not continental in its consciousness, had started in the 1930s, in the mid-1930s, but it was mainly focused on South African languages. And it was led by a dramatist who came from Natal, which is what is now called KwaZulu-Natal, by the name of Herbert Dlomo. And he wrote in the South African Outlook in the 1930s that it would benefit South African writing if a language, an African language, could be developed that would unite all the African languages and which would speak the South African, at least the Black South African reality throughout the country. But that debate was never really engaged in the South African Academy. And for reasons, the South African Academy was dominated by, by settler colonialists. So it modeled itself around British universities or Dutch universities. South Africa from 1910, after the conquest in the late 19th century, became a white country, de facto a white country. So African languages did not have as much access to higher education as English had. And of course, the Dutch language was also an official language after the institution of the Union of South Africa government in 1910. So outside of English and Dutch, which later became Afrikaans, because the Dutch language sort of lost its power in South Africa. The more the Dutch people decided that they were now Africans, and was replaced by a language that sounded like Dutch but was not Dutch, called Afrikaans. So the Union of South Africa, a government which was formed between British settlers and the Dutch settlers, kept Africans and African cultural, political, and linguistic examples out of the political and the social life of South Africa. So South Africa was a white country, both in terms of its social and its political life, and in terms of dispossession. It was also a country that was dominated by well, what one would call British and Dutch cultural examples. So the language debate in South Africa didn't really take place beyond the borders of South Africa, and the language about African languages didn't take place outside the small enclaves of the universities, where those who taught African languages, those Africans who taught African languages, advocated for a literature and a cultural expression that would be African. So what we are looking at here is the beginning of a debate in South Africa about South Africa's position in the rest of the continent culturally and politically. Of course, South Africa is already part of the continent. It is part of what used to be called the Organization of African Unity, which is today called the African Union. In fact, the chair of the African Union is the current president of South Africa. So politically, South Africa has become part of the African continent since 1994, since the opening up of the country after the collapse of apartheid. But culturally, and in terms of literature, South Africa remains very much insular. Indeed, there is migration between countries across the continent, and South Africa has become part of that movement of people across national borders. But in terms of culture, in terms of its cultural outlook, in terms of its literary production, in terms of the themes that writers take up, South Africa remains very much the old country that looks inward for its cultural examples. There are indeed some attempts to capture some of what the continent looks like, but the arguments about language and about founding a continental language that would represent the cultural unity of South Africa remains very much a dream at this moment. So I'm interested in the debate that Ngugi inaugurated in 1986 about the need for a language that would represent an African consciousness. And I'm interested in this debate against the background of the types of consciousness, of cultural consciousness that have dominated Africa and South Africa in particular, because I can only speak from that limited position of where I am, of my own location in South Africa. And South Africa for a very long time wasn't really part of the rest of Africa. So its consciousness of culture, its consciousness of language was regional. And apartheid made sure that languages would develop separately. Apartheid was about separateness. It was called at some point separate development or pluralism. In other words, each to his own. Languages must develop separately. And apartheid conceived of language groups as nations. In other words, if you spoke Zulu as your language and you came from Natal, you belonged to the Zulu nation and you went to a Zulu university. If you spoke an Indian language, you went to an Indian university or university created for Indians, where you would speak that language and you would identify as a member of an Indian nation. If you spoke Xhosa, again, you would be identified with the Xhosa nation. So apartheid was about separating people along racial lines, but also along linguistic lines and cultural lines, so that whites were considered either of the Dutch descendants or of the British descendants. And those of the Dutch descendants adopted a language and a culture called Afrikaans, which was made official within the Union government. And of course, those who had come from Britain as British settlers spoke English and went to English-speaking universities. So there were English-speaking universities, white-speaking English-speaking universities. There were white Afrikaans speaking universities. There were African universities, but also divided into language groups, so that you had the University of Zululand in Natal, you had the University of the Transkei for the Xhosa people in the Eastern Cape, you had the University of Venda in the north of the country, and so on and so forth. So languages in South Africa developed separately. So this idea of even a national linguistic consciousness did not exist in South Africa, much less a continental linguistic consciousness. So I'm really interested in the way in which that reality has persisted, that reality has continued. So I'm going to show on the screen the map of Africa, with South Africa at the bottom of that map. And then the provinces which we have in South Africa today, 9 of them are also provinces that are divided according to according to the different languages that are spoken in them. Even though post-apartheid South Africa looks somewhat different to the apartheid South Africa in terms of the movement of people, in terms of language mixing, in terms of people who speak different languages, African and English, there still is that legacy of apartheid in these provinces. So that, for example, in KwaZulu-Natal, which is on the east coast of the country, the dominant language is Zulu. In the Eastern Cape, which is south of KwaZulu-Natal, which is also a coastal province, the Xhosa language is spoken there. In the Western Cape, you find the English language dominating, but also Afrikaans, because it is in the Cape that the Dutch settled or first settled the country, even though later, after the British arrived, they moved northwards to provinces such as the Free State, the Northwest Province, Gauteng, in the Northern Cape. And the Northern Cape and the Western Cape would then be dominated by English in the Western Cape and Afrikaans in the Northern Cape. And the African languages spoken in the Western Cape and the Northern Cape are, well, Zulu and Xhosa, but predominantly Xhosa, because the Cape, the Western Cape and the Northern Cape are closer to the Eastern Cape, where the Xhosa language is spoken predominantly. In the Free State, you find a language called Sotho. In Northwest, in the Northwest Province, you find a language called Tswana. If I can scroll down to the languages there, you have Sotho. In the Free State, you have Tswana. In the Northwest, you have Northern Sotho. In Venda, which is the Northern Province, in Venda. So you have, sorry, in the Northern Province, you have Venda and Tsonga, the two languages spoken there. And as you can see, the Zulu language is spoken in KwaZulu-Natal on the east coast of the country. And in terms of the distribution of ethnicities, you have in the Western Cape what is called the colored people. Those are people of mixed race who, because the British settlers and the Dutch settlers settled there, resulted from the intermixing of the original people of the Western Cape, the San and the Khoi, and the British and the Dutch settlers. So you find a concentration of mixed race people in the East, in the Western and Northern Cape, and they speak Afrikaans predominantly. And in the hinterland, that is from the coast, the southern coast, the eastern coast of South Africa, right up to the northern province, bordering the southern African countries, you have Black people predominantly found in those areas. But that doesn't mean that post-apartheid has retained this type of demographics. You have now an easier and a more flexible distribution of languages, a more widespread distribution of ethnicities, and of course the mixing of those ethnicities and the mixing of those languages. But the map of South Africa, that is the language map of South Africa, remains pretty much stable, except those movements caused mainly by urbanization, caused by the attraction of the cities and the rural areas, which used to be, well, the custodians of African languages and African cultures, have since the collapse of apartheid sort of been eroded to a large extent, so that people are moving to the cities in increasing numbers, and the language map has become much more complicated than the one on the screen. Now, my interest, of course, is whether the idea of a continental language is possible, could be applied to South Africa or to the South African reality. So it was only after the 1820s that the settlers, let me just start from the beginning. So before the arrival of the Dutch settlers in the Cape in 1652 and the British conquest of the Cape in 1795, South Africa did not exist as a unified country that it is today. Rather, it was composed of language and clan groups, most of whom had migrated to the south of Africa from the Great Lakes region, which is today called the Congo. The original inhabitants of the southern tip of Africa, which is now called South Africa, were the San people, also known as the Bushmen, a nomadic people, and the Khoi, who were a settled agricultural people. So the San were a nomadic people, while the Khoi were an agrarian people. Both were subjugated by the Dutch and the British after the conquest of the Cape. Now, it was only after the 1820s that the settlers ventured beyond the Cape to the rest of the country and fought wars with Africans who had by then formed stronger African tribes. The Xhosa people in what is now the Eastern Cape, the Zulu people in KwaZulu-Natal, etc., across the country, right up to the north, to the far north of what is today called South Africa. The Dutch settlers who had been expelled from the Cape by the British fought the Zulus in 1838, and the British fought and were defeated by the Zulus in 1879, even though they won the second battle in 1883. In 1899, the British fought the Dutch, and in 1902, so the settlers fought a war between themselves, and in 1902, they struck a truce, which resulted in the creation of a Union of South Africa government in 1910. The Union of South Africa government was a white government which governed the whole country, but excluded Africans from active participation in the affairs of the country, including their own affairs, that is the Africans' own affairs. An African journalist and later first secretary of the South African Native National Congress, Solomon Plaatje, wrote in his book, Native Life in South Africa, which was published in 1915, about land dispossession and the exclusion of Africans from Union. The languages of the Union government were English and Dutch. And in 1925, Dutch was replaced by Afrikaans, which was an adopted language of the Dutch descendants. So throughout the Union government, African languages developed in isolation of each other within regional enclaves, except in urban areas, which rose on the back of a mercantile or export economy. In Johannesburg in particular, where the demand for labor was high after the discovery of gold at the end of the 1800s, Africans from different language regions who went to work on the gold mines had to invent a common language of communication out of the strands of their regional languages. And this language came to be known as Fanagalo, which translated into English means it's like this. As the word suggests, this was a functional language used simply to demonstrate how something is done. So do it like this, do it like that. So the language Fanagalo was created out of the different regional languages that the migrant workers spoke, but they obviously had to find a common language on the mines where they came together from different parts of the country. And this language became Fanagalo, but it was a demonstrative language which was used simply demonstrate how things are done. So in this sense, Fanakalo had no philosophical or political dimension to it. In other words, one could not say that it was a language that could develop beyond its utility, beyond its use. So it was useful, firstly, for mine bosses to communicate instructions to the mine workers, and secondly, for mine workers from different language groups to communicate among themselves. However, it signaled the possibility of a South African polyglot, in other words, of a person who could speak or understand different languages from different language groups. For instance, a South African poet by the name of Jeremy Cronin captured this moment of the rise of Fanakalo, of the rise of this language, in a poem called To Learn How to Speak, a poem which suggests not just the simple utility of Fanakalo, but its political meaning as a language, encompassing what he called in that poem the voices of the land. It is an interesting poem to read because in that poem he is advocating for a common language that could be spoken across South Africa, across language groups, including Afrikaans and English, the two European languages which were dominant in South Africa at the time. He is advocating in this poem, which was written in the late 1970s, a language created out of necessity on the mines that would speak of a South African reality. But of course, a language that could speak of a South African reality had to have other qualities that South Africans shared in common. But during apartheid, South Africans didn't share very much in common. So even that language that was developed on the mines could not be seen philosophically and politically as representative of the consciousness of language in different parts of the country, because I conceive of language, or at least I'm going to conceive of language after this introduction as divided into at least 3 different forms of consciousness, in particular in South Africa. That would be the local consciousness, in other words, a Zulu person who speaks Zulu reality in the Zulu language. And that regional consciousness was enthusiastically enforced by apartheid, which sought to divide people according to language. So there was a strong regional consciousness, a strong ethnic consciousness, if you like, in which one's language defined one's identity, defined one's national consciousness, and defined one's self. One's outlook was, during apartheid, defined by one's language consciousness, that one spoke this language, and therefore one was that language and the reality that that language portrayed. The second kind of consciousness that I want to explore here is what I want to call a national consciousness that is after the end of apartheid. Even though apartheid saw different language groups as nations, there was resistance to that idea by Africans. Africans argued that before colonialism and before apartheid, there was no strict linguistic division which informed one's identity, informed one's movements, informed who one married. But during apartheid, of course, language defined the boundaries of one's own identity, of one's own nation, of one's own a sense of being. So Fanakalo, as proposed by Jeremy Cronin in his poem To Learn How to Speak, is a language that has the potential to speak the realities of everyone across the country, could not be that language for the simple reason that I have mentioned, that it could never be a language of philosophy, a language of politics, beyond its usefulness in a very particular particular space that is the mines in which that language was used. So because of its political origins as a language that grew out of necessity and dispossession, Fanagalo never quite left the mines, nor did it shed its stigma as a language of economic utility that bound the laborer to the master. It was a language of masterhood, really, even though it was useful for the mine workers to communicate among themselves. But its real purpose was to bind the mine laborer to the master. The master could issue instructions in that language, and the master could control what the mine workers communicated while on the mine. So it was really a slave language, if you like, a language of utility. So the Union government ended in 1948. It had begun in 1910, and it ended in 1948 after the defeat of the British settlers, who then identified themselves as English-speaking white South Africans by the Dutch. So in 1948, in an election, the Union government ended with the defeat of the British. Remember that the British and the Dutch had formed a Union government to govern together and excluded Africans from the political life of the country. But in 1948, the Union government ended with the defeat of the British settlers, who were at the time English-speaking white South Africans, who were no longer identified with Britain as such, by the Dutch, who then identified themselves as Afrikaners, who no longer identified with the Netherlands, with Holland in the election. So from 1948, the Afrikaner government set about instituting racial laws and promoting Afrikaans, their language, which was a hybrid language consisting of Dutch, coinages from English, local languages of the Cape, such as Xhosa, San language, and Khoi languages. In other words, it was an assemblage dominated by the Dutch language, but an assemblage of languages that were also local, and English, which was coined to resemble a certain kind of what the Dutch people in Holland called baby Dutch. But they also, that is the apartheid government, also set about re-tribalizing African languages. In other words, by sending Africans into their language homelands, which came to be known as the Bantustans. The word Bantu means people, but it was used derogatively by the Afrikaners to mean someone of a subhuman status. So the Bantu languages, as the Afrikaner government, the apartheid government called them, were basically denuded and made to be languages of communication or tribal languages of communication between tribal groups. They were not given a philosophical status. They were not given a high cultural status. They were not even given the status of being languages of university education, that is intellectual languages. And I'm pointing these things out. In other words, I'm historicizing my approach to this language debate for the simple reason that if one is to talk about a continental language, even a national language, one must also pay close attention to what I call regional languages, which in South Africa developed in separation. So I have spoken about a regional consciousness, or what one would call an ethnic consciousness in the development of South African languages, so that if you were Zulu, you lived in a Zulu area and you went to a Zulu university. And that is a consciousness or a regional consciousness that was entrenched by apartheid deliberately by creating language boards. In other words, the study of Zulu in Natal was done through a Zulu language board, and it was controlled by that board. What passed as Zulu had to be filtered through the determinations of a language board, and that happened throughout the country, so that you had had a language board for the Xhosa language, you had a language board for the Zulu language, and those managed the production and dissemination of that language in schools and even in universities. But also a strange phenomenon happened in universities, which spoke of apartheid control of African languages, what they could speak, what they could write. You would find that in departments of African languages at South African universities during apartheid, white Afrikaners were the dominant members of those departments. They taught African languages, some of them couldn't speak those African languages well, but others had grown up on farms where Africans worked, and they had picked up the language from there and studied it in school. So the production and dissemination of African languages, of African cultures, was heavily controlled during the apartheid period. It was heavily controlled by the white Afrikaner government, which had taken over in 1948. So if one wants to talk about a consciousness of language beyond the regional consciousness, one has to return to the circumstances in which the continental language has not existed, even after vigorous demands for it. And then the national consciousness in South Africa became, well, the broader idea of national consciousness became a reality after the collapse of apartheid. As I said before then, nationality was determined by one's language group. It was not a nationality that covered the country as a whole. So the national consciousness of language and of culture started to emerge after the collapse of apartheid. But what Ngugi is trying to argue in his book, Decolonizing the Mind, the Politics of Language in African Literature, is a continental consciousness of language, an idea of language as he puts it, an idea of language which would speak the realities of Africa, an idea of language which would be adopted by African writers wherever they are in Africa. And one could even say African writers in the diaspora outside of Africa. So when one looks at how language has developed in South Africa, one would be quite careful, one would be quite conscious about engaging arguments about a continental language consciousness. So the re-tribalization of African languages by apartheid created language ghettos, if you like, or language enclaves. And by this time, Africans had adopted a more worldly attitude. So the re-tribalization of African languages, African cultures, and African society went against, was antithetical to the consciousness of Africans themselves about a world beyond South Africa, beyond South Africa's borders. So during apartheid, Africans had adopted a more worldly attitude, in fact, including those who remained in rural areas. In this sense, apartheid was to the Africans a reversal of that worldly consciousness that their languages had opened up to, even though it was not a continental consciousness of language, but it was a more westernized idea of language, so that one poet by the name of Benedict Vilakazi, who came from Natal, wrote a poem called, wrote a collection of poems called African Horizons, or Zulu Horizons. In Zulu, it's called Amale Zulu. It's called, in English, it translates into Zulu horizons. That was the idea among educated Zulus in particular about language. That language was a horizon. It was an endless possibility. It opened up to horizons unknown. But those horizons, of course, in Vilakazi's poetry were the British or the Western European horizons. But there was already the idea that language was not something that spoke identity as such. That language opened up necessarily to other things, to other realities, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to speak about that consciousness which lies beyond the regional consciousness, the national consciousness, and the continental, that is the African continental consciousness. I'm going to speak about the worldly consciousness, which I believe Ngugi's argument does not take into account. It seems to me that Ngugi stops at the borders of the continent and does not really look at how the languages have developed beyond the horizons of the continent. And so a continental outlook or a continental consciousness of languages, of African languages, does not account for the reality of those languages themselves. So I'm going to place Ngugi's argument under that kind of pressure, the way in which, for example, the consciousness of hybridity was already inscribed in the literature of the Zulu people and of the people of other language groups in South Africa long before Ngugi's argument was promulgated and was intensified later by the scholarship that came after it. So until 1994, when apartheid ended as a state policy and the post-apartheid government was inaugurated, South Africa was not part of what one could call an African or continental consciousness. If we consider language as the substance of consciousness, South Africa did not speak with the voices of the continent. And I'm quoting here the words of the words from the poem by Jeremy Cronin, To Learn How to Speak, which I referenced earlier. He says, we must learn to speak with the voices of the land. Of course, the national consciousness that was inscribed in that poem during apartheid did not speak beyond the borders of the nation. But African literature and the consciousness of African languages within South Africa were not even national at the time, much less continental. So if we consider language as the substance of consciousness, South Africa did not speak with the voices of the continent. Apartheid was not only a policy of internal linguistic divisions, but it was also a policy of continental isolation. In this sense, the idea of the cultural unity of Africa was as foreign to South Africa as the idea of the political unity of the continent. South Africa was not part of the Organization of African Unity in the 60s, in the 70s, and in the 80s. It only joined that political body in the 1990s, a body which has now become the African Union. So South Africa did not, at the time, that is during apartheid, have a continental outlook, a continental consciousness, whether it is a political consciousness or a cultural consciousness. It was only those Africans who went into exile who could imagine this cultural and political unity, which informed their writing in various ways. But within the borders of the country, that consciousness, which lay beyond the regional consciousness, did not exist. Now, if we talk about those writers who, South African writers, in particular Black South African writers who went into exile, we could look at the titles of their works, for example, of their autobiographies, because the autobiographical form became very popular during this time, written by exiles who were reflecting on their lives back home in South Africa. So the titles of autobiographies of memoirs, of fiction, of art and political tracts pointed to this continental consciousness by exiles who were not living in South Africa at the time. And I could mention a few writers such as Ezekiel Mpahlele, who wrote an autobiography called Africa, My Music. And one sees here that it is not South Africa that is the point of reference, but Africa as a whole. And I can speak of Louis Nkosi's Home and Exile, which is a memoir about being elsewhere and remembering home as a distant land. But there's an African consciousness, an African continental consciousness in Home and Exile. In fact, Louis Nkosi wrote another book called Tasks and Masks, in which he advocated for a continental consciousness, a continental cultural consciousness, in which he advocated for a borderless continent in which one could travel across borders at will. And Ngugi, in his arguments, also advocates for that idea of the problem of the nation states and of borders. So this literature, such as Africa, My Music, Home and Exile, Blame Me on History, Tell Freedom, View from Koyaba, by exiles who were looking back at South Africa and on South Africa with a longing eye, but with an eye to opening up its borders to the rest of Africa and indeed to the rest of the world. So some of these writers joined or participated, these exiled writers joined or participated in cultural movements in African countries that had gained independence, such as Nigeria, Kenya, Guinea, Ghana, the Congo, which was then called Zaire, and so on and so forth. And here I'm talking about writers, but I'm also talking about musicians, I'm talking about artists who had left South Africa on what was called the one-way exit permit. In other words, you were not allowed back if you left for political reasons. And these people settled in some of these African countries and participated in the cultures of those countries, and so developed a sort of a continental consciousness of culture. But their writing was censored, was either banned in South Africa, not allowed in South African bookshops and libraries, or it was censored if it was felt that it could still be read. So certain parts of say, the novel would be excluded, parts which pointed to some political question and so on. So the end of apartheid then saw the beginning of the opening up of South Africa. And so the map that I have drawn so far is of a country in isolation and of languages, different language groups existing in isolation of one another. And so that idea of a consciousness beyond the regional one, beyond the consciousness of the divide and rule policy that apartheid imposed, was not available in South Africa during apartheid. So the end of apartheid saw the beginning of the opening up of South Africa to the rest of the continent. But culturally, the country has remained largely insular, in my view, except in the cities where cultural and linguistic diversity has become more entrenched and more global. So what is the significance of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's thesis that African writers must return to their African languages post-colonialism? In 1986, Ngugi wa Thiong'o published a book entitled Decolonizing the Mind, The Politics of Language in African Literature, in which he argued that the choice of language and the use to which language is put is central to a people's definition of themselves in relation to their natural and social environment. He went on to declare that henceforth he would stop writing creatively in English. As the head of the English department of the Department of English at the University of Nairobi in Kenya, he proposed that the department's name be changed from the Department of English to the Department of African Literature. Now, this debate about Africanization has not taken off in South Africa, and in particular, in the South African Academy. Despite having been promoted quite forcefully by Thabo Mbeki, the second president of post-apartheid South Africa, Mbeki was not just a political figure, but was something of an Africanist cultural ambassador. In his political and presidential speeches, he often opened with quotes from African literatures from across the continent, thus binding South Africa to Africa's past, present, and future. Against this background, the question that I want to pursue in this presentation is, why has the language debate not taken off in South Africa on the grand scale that Ngugi wa Thiong'o imagined in his study? And I contend that in South Africa, the combined forces of history, the different moments of modernity, and the nature of the country's transition from apartheid to post-apartheid has not followed the example of post-independence in the rest of Africa. And if I could say this again, I want to contend that in South Africa, the combined forces of history, the different moments of modernity, and the nature of the country's transition from apartheid to post-apartheid has not followed the example of post-independence in the rest of Africa. In this sense, unlike independence from the British, the French, or the Portuguese in other parts of Africa, South Africa experienced a longer period of settler rule, from British colonial rule to Afrikaner apartheid rule. During this time, different ideas about language, culture, identity, nation, and place complicated the path from colonialism to post-colonialism. It also extended the life of European languages as languages of modernity and power beyond the experience of most of the continent. So that is going to be my contention, and I would like to get out of my slides and speak directly now. So let me go back.
Admin, help him. You stop sharing, sir. Yes.
Now, how long do I have? How
sir,
much
you have
time?
Another 15 minutes, sir. No problem. 15 minutes.
Okay, that will be enough for me. Now, the issues that I have raised relate to the relationship between South Africa and the rest of the continent. But when I speak about the rest of the continent, I'm not speaking from a position of knowledge of the rest of the continent, because I would imagine that with about 2,000 African languages in Nigeria, one would have the same reality of different languages speaking different realities elsewhere in the world. So that the argument about one language, or the argument about a single language that is able to portray a single reality is a contradiction in terms. Even in his own country, Kenya, Ngugi could not convince all and sundry that his own language, Kikuyu, could stand for African languages in general. In fact, the criticism within Kenya, within his own country, of Ngugi's advocation of African languages as if they were self-enclosed, was that he was advocating Kikuyu nationalism, that he was advocating his own language for his own ends, and that in any case, he didn't share the reality that he was talking about as he was elsewhere in the world, in America and in Europe. And that when he decided not to write in English, but to write in an African language, his works were translated into English anyway, and that his critical work was in English, and that the audience that he was addressing in his African languages was a very sectional audience from his own ethnic background. So this idea and this desire for a continental language, or at least a unifying language, is also, in my view, an example of what one would call a monistic pathos. In other words, this idea that everything must be reduced to one, that even within a single language, there is a oneness. In other words, a single language speaks of the same reality, which is why in one of the articles that I sent through from a book by a Nigerian writer by the name of Kole Omotoso called Season of Migration to the South. He disputes this argument, Ngugi's argument, that English was imposed or that European languages were imposed, and argues that there was always a negotiation, even though colonial languages were languages of power, but there was always a negotiation between the local African languages and the languages of empire. In fact, the poet that I referred to earlier, Benedict Vilakazi from Natal, wrote in one of his poems that I mentioned that as he grew more and more aware of the horizons of his language, that it could speak more realities, the realities began to clash in his head. So the entire collection of his poems called Zulu Horizons is not about Zuluness. It's not about an essential identity that is marked by his being Zulu or his speaking of Zulu. The entire collection is about how Zulu itself gathers momentum by becoming more flexible, by breaking its own borders and admitting into its own linguistic framework other languages as well. And Omotoso, in Season of Migration to the South, argues the same point about Nigeria, at least about himself, that his consciousness of language was both local or regional, national, but also beyond Africa. It was also English, it was also Arabic, that his studies of Arabic literature gave him an extra horizon beyond which he could look upon other cultural, other languages and cultures. But he also speaks about a phenomenon that Ngugi does not speak about in his argument, that the colonizer also adopts the language of the colonized, which was quite a dominant feature in South Africa, especially in the early days of colonialism, at the time of in the time of the missionaries. African languages in South Africa were developed in missionary stations. They were developed in missionary presses. Most of the writing in African languages was published by missionary presses. And you could see in those writings of that period, that is the late 19th century and the early 20th century, that translation between the missionaries and the Africans who had converted into Christianity. So the circumstances of any language, its origins, its development, its changes cannot be tracked by a kind of unilinear historical perspective. And I think that Ngugi's historical argument is persuasive in that he argues for a return to different kinds of African consciousnesses, but he does so by polarizing African languages to what he calls colonial or European languages, when in fact, in South Africa, in any case, there's the distinction between languages has become particularly difficult to identify, so that in Johannesburg, for example, a city that attracted migrants from different parts of the country, a 5-year-old would speak 11 languages. A 5-year-old would speak 11 languages, and those languages would coexist and sometimes would intermingle in the consciousness of that 5-year-old. So Johannesburg is a much more diverse, but also linguistically a very complicated city. And one could find the same thing developing in other cities in the country where movement has become quite the order of the day. And people, unlike during apartheid, people can now move across these provincial boundaries. And so you find that where Afrikaans used to be spoken almost exclusively, there are now other people who speak Afrikaans, English, and other African languages together in what is called code switching. And the literature that is arising out of this new reality of languages and of language mixing is literature of what is called, well, the post-transitional period, because the periods after apartheid have been called transitional after apartheid, and then post-transitional when we began to see literature that didn't refer to apartheid that much. And that literature was called post-transitional because apartheid was no longer the organizing principle of that literature. And we are now in a time that has not yet been defined because there is no language to define the time in which South Africa finds itself now, which is a time of self-writing, a time of writing about the city, a time of writing about a country beyond South Africa, a time when writing is more international, a time when migration is not just within the continent, but also across the continent. But it is also not migration outward by South Africa, and it is migration from elsewhere inward into South Africa, bringing different languages, bringing different cultures. But I still argue that South Africa remains insular. And this is because of the rise of what I called xenophobia. There is a kind of nationalism that emerged after apartheid. And this nationalism created what, well, one could predict as a desire to close borders, especially by South Africans who for a long time had their borders closed. But what I see today is, yes, kind of cross-migration from the country outward and from outward into the country, but also an intensification of borders, especially of physical ones, even though the intellectual ones, the language ones have broken down. I do see the intensification of physical borders. In other words, redefinition of space in terms of nation, in terms of who one is. And this is clearly seen in the kind of writing and the kind of cultural expression by immigrants from elsewhere on the continent. Recently, a film called Man on Ground was well, not so recently, but about 5 years ago, a film called Man on Ground came out, which was made by a Nigerian filmmaker. In fact, the son of Kole Omotoso, who wrote Season of Migration to the South. And in this film, he talks about an incident that happened in Johannesburg, the killing of a Mozambican national who had come to work in Johannesburg in a xenophobic attack. And in this film, he argues for a continental consciousness. At some point in the film, he says, the Nigerian who has come to look for his brother who has been murdered in South Africa says, well, I once listened to an interview with an astronaut who said, looking at the world from above makes one wonder why we have borders, because the world from up there has no borders. The borders are only in our minds. But for me, that argument, of course, in the film itself, you have a number of camera shots from above Johannesburg of a plane flying overhead, which of course diminishes the idea of borders and promotes, of course, that old idea of a borderless world and of a borderless continent. But it seems to me that argument still has to deal with borders, with the reality of borders, linguistic, cultural, and political borders as such. So that film advocates for a borderless world, for a world in which we can communicate. We could found a language, as Ngugi argues, that would speak across these borders. And while that idea has found acceptance culturally and to some extent linguistically, yet it has not found support politically. Me that Ngugi's argument, powerful as it is in its argument for the eradication of borders, which he calls colonial borders in Africa, still has to contend with the political realities in which that argument must be made. These political arguments are not arguments against colonialism anymore, but are also arguments from within the cultural spaces of Africans themselves. And it is that which I am still trying to engage, the way in which one cannot speak globally about language, one cannot speak globally about languages, that for one to speak about the cultural and the cultural unity of the language consciousness that constitutes the continent, one must begin by looking at the individual languages and the way in which they speak their own reality. Because one would be surprised to discover that these languages are not contained within themselves. They're actually more worldly than the continental consciousness that Ngugi's argument canvasses and advocates. Thank you very much. That is the end of my presentation.
Ma'am, please unmute. Sumati ma'am. Unmute. Ma'am, please unmute.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes,
please.
Is it okay?
Yes,
yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, Professor, that was an amazing session, good language returns that you gave us, and such a great force to understand the kind of the language that is interpreted in literature, in spoken language, in usage, and differential concepts. And it was a very, very informative and a knowledgeable session, dear doctor, and we thank you in immense. Let us go forward with the question sessions, and there are a lot of questions coming in a flow. Maybe about 20 of them are there, but I have selectively taken a few to put forward to you, okay? The first question goes to Dr. S.A. Thamirul Ansari from Jasan University, Saudi Arabia, right? He asks you, is English in South African context loaded with political power to pose threats to the very existence of Zulu, Xhosa, and Afrikaans and local regional languages? What would be your thought process on it? He's asking if English is posing a risk factor.
Right, thank you for that question. And I think it's one of the questions that have been debated, especially in South Africa, but also beyond South Africa. What is the status of English? or the status of colonial languages in Africa, where these languages are spoken by a minority. My view is that in South Africa, English continues to dominate the public life of South Africans. In other words, the political and economic life of South Africa, but also the intellectual life of South Africa, because it dominates in the universities and in the schools. There are arguments that schools and universities must begin to also promote the African languages in their own regions, so that, for example, the University of KwaZulu-Natal introduced about 3-4 years ago a compulsory module in Zulu, so that anyone who applies for promotion, for example, to, let's say, from assistant to associate professor to full professor, has to be able to teach in Zulu. Well, other universities were not very keen on it, but there are arguments for African languages to be promoted as equally as English has been promoted over the years. But English remains a dominant language among a few people. It is the language of politics, of public life, of economics, but it is not a language of the people, of the African people in general. And I would argue that the people who speak English as a second language fluently constitute about 10% of Africans in the country as a whole. So it is still a very minority language, which is a symbol of, I would say, a symbol of power, a symbol of economic power, of political power, a symbol of intellectual power. But that doesn't mean that those who don't speak English are powerless. They speak the languages that are not, as I argued, insular. In fact, Africans who speak African languages code switch. They speak, in one sentence, they would have English, Afrikaans, and Zulu. Those who come from areas that have Afrikaans, but generally, Africans who speak African languages would switch between an African language and English. Because Afrikaans has a history of apartheid repression. So very few people would mix their languages with Afrikaans. But there is a lot of code switching in South African speech, especially among Africans, young Africans in particular, those who have adopted a more cosmopolitan attitude towards the social, the political, and the linguistic. But I would agree that English remains the language of power because of its place in the academy, its place in politics, and its place in the economy.
Yeah, you're perfectly right, Professor. Since I've been there, I always find that English dominates more than the local languages, and the predominance is because even in the local languages, they add up English to speak. As he has said, it's true. Once you are there, you will understand how even in Zulu, there will be English, in Bemba, there will be English, in Tonga, there will be English. It is not completely perfect local language. So that's a good go, Professor. We go with the next question, and I have mixed up 2-3 questions from Gobinda Shaho, Saroja V. Kumar. They are talking about the present trend of writers, and they're saying that these writers don't have much of apartheid consciousness. They don't include apartheid consciousness. And do they have really the concern for the unprivileged sections? So, for example, Saroja says Nandima Godima's works, the truth behind apartheid. What would be your thought
Could you repeat the last part?
Mm-hmm.
Could you repeat the last part about Nadine Godimer?
Yeah, for example, Shaho says, Govinda Shaho says that present trend of African writers, they're concerned for unprivileged sections of people and less on apartheid literature consciousness. Apartheid consciousness is less in that literature. while Saroja says, how would you bring about Nadine Godimer's concern on truth of apartheid during
Yes,
the
thank
time
you.
of apartheid period, bringing out the truth of it?
Yes, I got it
So
now. Thank you.
You can mix
Now,
up and
yes, I will try and answer both of them.
yeah, in short, Professor,
now,
in short.
In short,
In
yes.
short, brief notes.
Yes, recent writing is more urban located. In other words, it's writing about the city in the city. And it is driven more by the middle class African university educated African writer, mostly young writers who are situating themselves post-apartheid and have no memory of apartheid as such. So that is the first part of it. The second part about Nadine Godimer, Nadine Godimer wrote most of her works during apartheid. So the consciousness in her literature is that of apartheid repression. And Godimer's post-apartheid writing, as most of the writing by those whites who wrote against apartheid during apartheid, started taking a more conservative turn. In fact, a biography by a British writer, Suresh Roberts, called No Cold Kitchen, which was very critical of Godimer's shift of attitude from her critical writing during apartheid to her more condemning or condemnation of post-apartheid, was seen to be that liberal switch, or that switch which was seen to be typical of white liberals after apartheid, who then had no home. In other words, they were rejected by those they had opposed during apartheid and were being rejected by the Africans post-apartheid. So those white liberals whose works were popular during apartheid found themselves without a home after apartheid. And so it started agitating for a liberal democracy, and in their writing sought to be critical of both apartheid and post-apartheid politics. So Godimer found herself in that middle space that came to characterize the liberals after apartheid.
Thank you, Professor. That was a good one. We take a question from Dr. Armstrong. Is actually challenging you. If you wish to dismiss the stand taken by Thiongo, then how to protect regional languages in Africa? Is there any cultural nationalism? What is your point of view?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, and of course, I'm very critical of not all of Ngugi's argument. In other words, I accept the premise that language must begin, well, African languages in particular must begin to claim, or at least to make a claim for recognition, a claim for equal recognition, which has not happened, at least as consistently as one would have expected it to happen within Africa. But my query with Ngugi's argument is that it is not based on a careful understanding of the languages of which he speaks. So that when he speaks about Gikuyu becoming the language of cultural and literary expression in Kenya, the Kenyans themselves say he doesn't understand their own use of Gikuyu. That their use of Gikuyu is not ethnic, it is not insular, it is not a language without complexity. In other words, it is a language that has adopted a worldly attitude beyond the ethnicity that he advocates, hence the criticism of his stance that he is advocating a Kikuyu nationalism. But beyond that, because he also argues for African languages in a certain ethnic form, in my view, to become languages of cultural expression, I would call upon that same argument to the attention of the nature of the complexity of those languages, which is why in South Africa, apartheid's attempt to regulate African languages, to entrench them as languages of identity and nation, was rejected quite actively because Zulus, Xhosas, realized that he was creating language ghettos. Apartheid was creating language ghettos. And of course, Ngugi could argue that, well, I'm not advocating for the regulation of languages. I'm advocating for their free expression, which is well and good. But again, the debate must be centered on the nature of the different languages themselves, which is why it seems to me the problem of founding a language that would speak beyond regions and nation has not really materialized. It might materialize at some point, but it hasn't materialized. And my question is why?
Hope Dr. Armstrong is listening to his explanation and your validation to that. It's an acceptance or no? You can talk over to Gandhi. Then we move on with another discussion with the Achebe. Is it right that a man should abandon his mother tongue for someone else? The old passage is being typed by one Mrs. Rajeshwara Pushpam Amalraj. And she says, is the statement's universality. She says, for any colonized land, is it universally accepted? How could we overcome this language colonization?
Now, Achebe's standpoint with regard to this question was that, well, I got this language and I'm going to use it. In other words, I'm not going to stop using Igbo, his own language, but if I get, to speak German, I'm going to use German, as long as this language is able to speak my reality and the reality that I aspire to beyond my local one. So there's a sense in which Achebe's view goes beyond the insularity or the idea of language as insular, language as self-contained, language as American or British or as American. His idea is that language, and this is the reality of Nigeria in particular, that English is no longer even English in Nigeria, the way the Nigerians speak it. They don't speak it in the way in which the Queen or a British person would speak English. And then there have been arguments alongside Ngugi's argument that we live in a time of Englishes, not one English. Germany, for example, has adopted English as a language of power and of government recently. So it is no longer, in my view, a fight waged against colonialism. It is now a fight waged against internationalism. And the way in which that fight can be fought is by, as Achebe argued, bending the language to the rules of something else.
Thank you, Professor. We move forward to one Mr. Mir Muzdul Hogg. He asks, how do you situate South Africa differently, apart from the rest of African countries, in terms of cultural consciousness? How different is the cultural consciousness in South Africa compared to any other parts of Africa?
Now, I would say that South Africa has a history that the rest of Africa doesn't have. South Africa was colonized was settled by the Dutch in the 17th century, in the mid-17th century, in 1652, who didn't really colonize the country. They settled in the Cape, in one part of the country, the Cape, and they lived a very insulated existence, which explains apartheid later when they took over power. They lived a very isolated and insulated existence. They didn't want to live among everyone else, especially they didn't want to live among Africans, who were the only people they encountered at the Cape. And when the British came towards the end of the 1700s in 1795 and conquered the Cape and drove the Dutch out of the Cape, they came with a colonial attitude. In other words, they were not just interested in one part of the country, they were also interested in the rest of the country, which is why they colonized the rest of the country and imposed British culture, its language, its sports. You had cricket fields coming up in the country, soccer fields, and its religion, churches, its education, city libraries, and the city hall. So the British were colonists. So English spread much faster than Afrikaans because the Dutch didn't care about spreading any power beyond the Cape. So Africans were exposed to English more than they were to Afrikaans, for example. And those Africans who went to schools adopted English as not just a language of communication, but also a cultural language. And so South Africa sort of became anglicized. Even if you didn't speak English, you still followed British sports, you still played soccer, you still went to church, you still went to the town hall, you still attended British cultural festivals. In fact, the earliest translations from European cultural expressions to African languages was the translations of Shakespeare and the translations of the Bible. The earliest was the translation of the Bible and of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, a religious tract. And later, it was the translation of Shakespeare, and Shakespeare's plays would be staged in African languages, and people who didn't speak English, who wouldn't have known that these were translations of Shakespeare, enjoyed the stories nevertheless. So there was always active translation between English as a culture and African languages, which is why my argument is that there's a longer history and a more complicated history between languages, in particular between African languages and English. And so the current culture in South Africa is now more American than English, of course, more American than British, because America is all over the world. One would find American culture across the world, and so on. And well, one always expects that there will always be contests over which culture dominates. But currently in South Africa, the culture very urban, very American, and very English, especially in the urban areas among young Africans.
Please unmute. Somebody, please unmute.
Yes. Is it okay? Yes, Professor, there are a lot of questions to you, but since you're explaining too long, we are not able to pose them to you. But still, I will give you one last question, if you don't mind. There are a lot of questions on African language, basically, how many language each one can speak, where is Swahili coming from, those things. These are like GK. I feel that they can help themselves. Swahili is from Tanzania, to be very precise. But there is one question like, which is the best language to adapt in writing African literature? And then precisely, will that be very productive a language? I think that would be good for the day.
within South Africa.
Professor?
In South Africa or on the continent?
It's in literature, African literature.
Well, the language that has been promoted by a number of writers is Swahili. But in South Africa, hardly anyone speaks Swahili.
Swahili, yes, it's from Tanzania. Yes. Yeah. But then, which would be the most productive language? The language that can be adaptable or acceptable, a best language to adapt in writing, as far as African literature is concerned.
Within South Africa?
Yeah, must be, but there's just African literature, referred African literature.
Well, African literature, if we conceive it broadly, would not at the moment have a language that is common to everyone. You would find African writers arguing very differently about what language they want to use. So at the moment, I have not seen a language coming to the fore as a language that could be used for African literary expression. In South Africa, the languages are still very much the old languages within different regions. And I would say the language that has more influence across the board among those who can read English.
So thank you so much, Professor. It was a splendid session that we had with you. No doubt education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. We come to know of that impact now through you. It was a wonderful session with you, with the glorious terms to understand in terms of knowledge that is in terms of the reality of the people, the culture, the nativity, and furthermore, the way that you have put forward with so much of connotative context to your living in South Africa, the consciousness of language beyond the apartheid, the regional consciousness, the continental consciousness, and the re-tribalization of the local languages, as you would say. And we are immensely happy to have heard all this, because in India, we have a differential impact to language. And your learning skills to language and me being there for quite long years, I do feel that African languages are unique with a mix of a lot of colonization. There is a lot of Dutch in the language, French in the language, Portuguese in the language, and something that is very interesting. And more so, being there, I have not learned much, but for one or two words, because English was at the dominance. So thank you so much, Professor. You made the session very interesting. We will never forget it. And all the credits go to the organizers, the main, what do we say, the academic heads and the brain behind this scenario, Dr. Mark, Dr. Armstrong, and Dr. Jayapriya, the caliber of the differential universities of South India. They are the top notches of the reality, with Dr. Ramasubbu assisting them, and the department of his with the concerned college taking a lead role with the co-organizers. It's something unique and grand, and we as the audience and the participants really have enjoyed the day 5, and I think another few more days to go, and it's going to be enthralling. Thank you, dear Professor, and great to know you. When some time permits, we will meet again. Thank you so much, and it was a pleasure having you here. Good day to you.
Yes. Sumaya. Yes, sir. Mark Armstrong, please.
So thank you so much. Your lecture was very, very performative. You have performed your ideas. It was really inspiring, and many participants have posted a lot of positive comments about your lecture. It is really inspirational for all the participants. And I also thank Sumati for her brilliant coordination in the beginning.
Thank you, Professor.
The commitment to the speakers, to the post questions. It is very brilliantly done. Thank you so much. and thank Mngadi also.
Thank you very much to everyone. I really appreciate your coming to this presentation, and I hope that I have contributed to the discussion in a modest way, but in an informative way as well. It is, of course, a discussion that I'm exploring. It's not something that I would say I have answers to. I'm raising arguments more than I'm providing answers to this discussion.
That is your success, Professor. That is your success. That is the success of your lecture.
Well, I hope that I am successful in engaging this discussion and this debate, which seems to me to be a bigger debate than it has been engaged. It just seems to me that questions of language are complex questions because language crosses many of the boundaries that we set up for it. And in many ways, it's a debate that needs to be carefully engaged. And also, my sense is that there is sometimes an exaggerated faith in language. In other words, there's also modesty that one requires when dealing with questions of language, because language itself sometimes breaks down under the weight of experience and under the weight of many other things. So language is not always the instrument that is capable of doing what it claims to be able to do.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank
you, Doctor.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks to my moderator, and thanks to the audience that came to listen. Thank you, Dr. Marx. Thank you, Dr. Amasubia. Thank you, Dr. Chapter.
Thank you, Professor.
And I hope that I'll be able to see you again one day after the pandemic.
Yes, please come to India.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Participants, few announcements, please stay tuned to us. I'll take 2 or 3 minutes. We have witnessed, so far we have witnessed only 2 sessions a day, but there is a change tomorrow. We are going to have 3 sessions. There is no change in, there is no change in the morning, but in the afternoon we have 2 sessions. So it is scheduled in the post which we have sent it. Now the session will start at 3 o'clock, but there is a change that the session starts at 2:30 tomorrow. There are 2 sessions in the afternoon. First session starts at 2:30, from 2:30 to 3:30, and the second session from 3:30 to 4:30. And the first session will be addressed by Dr. Habib on disabled studies, and the second session that you have been waiting for a long time to be delivered by Dr. Marx, and who is going to deliver this lecture on subaltern studies. And another important information or instruction from the host team that we are planned to conduct a quiz, multiple choice questions, as it is given in the brochure, or as we discussed earlier, that we are going to conduct tomorrow. So after the session, after the third session, we are going to circulate this quiz in the form of Google Forms. It will be shared in the in all the groups in WhatsApp. We have 3 groups in WhatsApp, and then we have Telegram. We will share the Google Forms in all the 3 groups, and 50 questions, 100 marks. Each question carries 2 marks. So you are expected to choose the right answer and submit the Google Forms before any before the next day, before the end of the first session. So you are expected to submit it on Tuesday, and take your own time and submit the Google Forms. And there is a request, all the participants, you please take your test seriously. You are expected to secure at least 50% of marks. So with these few words, we'll wind up the session, and we have only 247 participants. The same thing will start in the WhatsApp groups and Telegram group. Thank you so much. Admin, please wind up the session.
Thank you all.